Okay, great. Okay, I will say a few words in Catalan to give you a welcome and then we will switch to English. Benvinguts, benvingudes. Soc el Michele Catanzaro, soc un periodista i el moderador d'aquest acte i us dono la benvinguda de part del Jordi Serrallonga, el ponent de ciència de l'Ateneu Barcelones, que no pot ser aquí per una qüestió de salut, res greu, per sort, però m'ha recomanat que us enviï les seves salutacions i també la benvinguda de part de l'Ateneu. Comencem per agrair les organitzacions que han participat en aquest acte, Telàpolis, que està ocupant de l'streaming, l'Obra Social La Caixa, que ens ha recolzat, l'Associació Catalana de Comunicació Científica, que s'està ocupant de la comunicació a través de les xarxes socials d'aquest acte, i crec que no oblido cap altre. Recordareu, potser alguns de vosaltres, que fa 2 anys o 3, de fet, vam fer la primera trobada Homo scientificus europaeus a l'Ateneu, i era un dels moments més greus de la crisi. En aquell moment eren associacions de científics Grassroots, és a dir, des de baix del sud d'Europa, que es van trobar aquí per fer el punt d'on érem i cap a on volíem anar. Llavors és realment fantàstic que això hagi tingut continuïtat i que ara ens trobem aquí organitzacions ja de tot Europa i amb una actitud propositiva, amb l'esperança de poder crear una xarxa entre totes aquestes organitzacions. Mentrestant han passat coses molt importants. És d'ahir al vespre la notícia que l'organització de la Marxa de la Ciència Central ha comptabilitzat quantes persones han marxat en el dia de la Marxa de la Ciència. Es tracta de més d'1 milió de persones. És probablement la manifestació més gran sobre un tema científic que hi ha hagut mai a la història. És evident que hi ha unes ganes creixents de col·laborar. Tots sabem que a cada país tenim problemes diferents i realitats diferents, però queda cada vegada més evident que és important fer xarxa, connectar-nos i que les solucions han de ser globals o almenys a escala europea. Doncs esperem que aquest acte serveixi per crear aquesta xarxa o aquest núvol, diguem-ne com ha proposat el Gilles, on hi hagi un empoderament de científic, una veu pròpia dels científics que abordin aquestes qüestions. Doncs disfruteu del dia i et deixo la paraula, Gilles.
Okay. Thank you, Michele, for this first glimpse within our meeting. And so I will follow in English and to first present finally the concept of Homo scientificus europaeus in the sense of its mother association EuroScience. So we have used this expression Homo scientificus europaeus for the first time 4 years ago with Sabine Louet at a time when we published the first issue of the new version of the website EuroScientist. EuroScientist is the website of the association, the Grassroots European Association EuroScience, and with EuroScientist and this concept of Homo scientificus europaeus, our goal was finally to support the development of the action of EuroScience throughout Europe, and EuroScience is also well known for the EuroScience Open Forum that is developed since more or less 15 years, and that will be organized in Toulouse next year. So with these tools, EuroScience, between the ESOF and EuroScientist, is engaged at the European forefront, looking for more relationship between scientists, citizens, and decision makers, and to promote some interaction and some crosstalk between science and society, and also to promote a crosstalk between bottom-up approach, which is the main issue for the EuroScientists to act in front of the top-down approach developed by decision makers with a way to impact on governance and science policies. So to come back to the Homo scientificus europaeus concept, you can see here that it is bio-inspired. It is bio-inspired because myself, I'm a molecular biologist since more than 30 years, and I've always learned many lessons from the biomolecule acting within the living cells. And here it's a lesson that you will understand in few minutes why. This short lesson here from the protein organization within our cells will lead to finally the concept of the cloud of Homo scientificus europaeus. Here you have designed in the background of the slide an illustration performed by David Goodsell. Well, you can see in a piece of cellular cytoplasm many proteins that are all in contact one to each other. And so the situation is very crowded in a cell. And finally, there is one question that is still remain not so clear. How many proteins are standing up in one cell? And the answer is more than 3 billions. 3 billions is a number that is generally unknown. Nobody has a clear idea about this number. And it's very important because it allows to better understand, better appreciate how a living cell is working, with a tight and dynamic packing involving many transient interactions between the protein, promoting a real protein cloud that is acting as a global matchmaker, and with as an impact the organization of the intracellular life. And this weak interaction between a huge number of proteins are very dynamic and allow finally the promotion of specific spatial networks of proteins, dynamic responsive subcellular architecture, and large-scale self-organization. So why I'm speaking about that? Because now you will see the fractal biomimicry model I am developing here, and jumping from proteins to humans. So here you have now a crowd of people that were present in the March for Science in Barcelona 3 weeks ago, and where you see that finally this crowded situation allow many transient interaction between all the scientists that are over there. And the goal of the Homo scientificus europaeus cloud finally is to promote this possibility at a big level within Europe, to aggregate as much as possible the pan-European grassroots associations and the Marche for Science communities in order all together, close to EuroScience and EuroScientist, to strengthen the bottom-up approach that can favor the contact between scientists and citizens, and the matchmaking towards open science, the matchmaking between bottom-up and top-down approaches, and providing a stronger interactions and relationship between science and society. So today, finally, we will, in a way or another, test the validity of this model by the debate that will be animated during the days. And we have organized this meeting with 4 sessions, with 2 moderators, Michele, which will follow the session in the morning, and Sabine Louet on the afternoon. And on the morning, we will have 2 sessions. The first with the participation of representatives of scientist grassroots associations. Then the second session will involve the Marche for Science communities and some of their representatives, to end the morning with a debate about the impact, the interest, and the possibility to develop this Homo scientificus europaeus cloud. Then we will go to the afternoon, and in the afternoon, Sabine will animate and moderate 2 sessions. One which will involve scientists from Barcelona that are main actors in the scene of the responsible research and innovation, and also the open science. Then the second session will approach and abord the problem of open science, its concept, a more general and maybe also conceptual thoughts about what is open science and why we feel concerned to develop this concept. And with this debate about open science, then we will address the questions about the possible interest for the Homo scientificus europaeus cloud, to finally consider this concept of open science and its development as a driving force, also to strengthen the organization of a global organization, European organization, that can allow the researchers to fit together, to stand together, and to be active together. So before ending this fast presentation, I strongly suggest to all of us and to all of the people that are listening to this talk to participate to the Homo scientificus europaeus cloud. And you can contact us, you can read the blog in EuroScientist, you can read the website in EuroScientist, you can follow our pages in Facebook and LinkedIn, you can buy our t-shirts, and you can become a member of EuroScience. So I will end now this presentation, and Michele will follow, starting with the first sessions with our participants here.
Okay, great. So, thanks a lot, Gilles. So we will have now around 45 minutes, 1 hour of contributions by members of Scientist Grassroots Association from several different European countries. Then we will have a coffee break. Then we will have a second session with representatives of the science marches. And finally, we will have a final debate, long debate, about the opinions of the speakers and of the public on the idea of a Homo scientificus europaeus cloud. So I would like to start with Mike Galsworthy from the from the United Kingdom. Mike Galsworthy is an independent consultant in research and innovation policy and a program director of Scientists for EU, a campaign by UK scientists to keep the UK in the European Union. He has a PhD in behavior genetics. As a consultant, he has analyzed national policies in the UK and also EU policies. So 10 minutes for you, Mike.
Good morning. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Have we? Good. Right. So Scientists for EU is now 2 years old. It started on May 8th, 2015, when David Cameron came to power, and with it came the promise of a referendum on membership of the EU. Scientists for EU now has over 210,000 followers on Facebook, 60,000 followers on Twitter. We also have a spin-out campaign called Healthier in the EU, which has over 100,000 followers on Facebook and 20,000 on Twitter. We are mainly communicating through social media, but also work with the press, work with politicians, work with other organizations. What I would like to do in this brief time is to go through how I got into this, what happened with science during the referendum campaign, what happened immediately after the vote, what fallout there's been, where the UK government is now in terms of its position with regard to the EU and science, and a vision for European science of what we should all be doing now to rescue the situation for all of us, but also take advantage of what we've got. But then, importantly, how do we sell this to the wider public? Because that is key. So, me personally, I started getting into science policy when I was in Slovenia working on an international project analyzing EU programs for life sciences, FP5 and FP6. And I had a lot of criticisms at that time about how the EU, the Commission, was running this. So I started producing papers on that, but then also got into popular writing on that. When I came back to the UK a few years later, I kept that going and also joined Scientists for Labour. And this was why during the general election of 2015, I was writing the policy documents for Scientists for Labour and getting extremely frustrated that none of our politicians seemed to care about science. They didn't seem to put it on the agenda. Therefore, the wider public didn't seem to care about science, and our few science journalists tend to talk about niche science issues rather than integrating it with the guts of economics and social solutions that feature during general election campaigns. So this is why on May 8th, 2015, when David Cameron won, and the others in Scientists for Labour were complaining about Labour having lost, I said, no, the issue now is that we've got this referendum coming up, and we are going to get science on that agenda, because this is different now. This is a society-wide debate. It has different dynamics. We need to go for it and really make sure that science is in this political agenda. So I suggested that we set up a Facebook page called Scientists for EU. It does what it says on the tin. And another guy within Scientists for Labour, Rob, said, okay, I've set up the page. You sort out the logo, let's go. And that weekend, we got 2,500 Facebook followers, 1,500 Twitter followers. Scientists were just saying, look at this name, back it, tell your friends to back it. Because we had had the experience within the UK and the science community of seeing all of the trash talking from our tabloid press about the EU, but we knew from our own personal experience how productive it had been to be part of the European team. So we really ramped up that channel of communication, and scientists started pouring on board to support us. We got interest from the press. The Times wanted us to write a letter to follow this up. We did. We got some big hitting names on it. And then we went about trying to connect with the other organizations that were going to be campaigning for the EU and putting together that team. The official campaign that came into place was called Stronger In. Britain Stronger in Europe. And we had particular problems with them, as did all of the other grassroots campaign organizations, because they were top-down and they were controlling. They did not provide exposure and they did not provide money. Rather, they expected all of this diversity of grassroots campaigns to merely echo their messages. So we got very little from them, but we did manage to get funding from Lord David Sainsbury for our own campaign, and that has continued since, and funding is an absolute lifesaver to empower you to do what you want to do. The arguments that we came up against during the campaign was, one, the money that we get from EU science into the UK is just recycled money, it's just a middleman. Two, we're being selfish, this is just scientists caring about their own money. And three, it's not going to be a problem when we leave because there are other countries like Turkey and like Israel that can buy into the EU science program. To deal with those quickly, one, it's not just recycling money because EU level money facilitates us to be able to do work that we can't do on the national level, like put together those international dream teams to do the bigger projects. Two, it's not selfish because the reason why we do science is to advance humanity in general, and there's lots of evidence that this is smart investment. And three, yes, it is a problem trying to buy in from outside, especially when you're the size of the UK, giving up your policy voice, and especially when you say you don't want free movement of people. We saw what happened with Switzerland. So that was the referendum campaign, and we lost. By the end of it, people at least knew what the entire science community thought, and it was pretty much the entire science community. But overall, there was a drive to pull away from the EU, to shake up the system, to gather back control, and to have everything determined at a national level. What did this mean for UK science? Well, immediately on the referendum result, what we did at Scientists for EU is we put out a survey to the science community via our Facebook, via Twitter, via contacts that we had through universities and other related organizations. And we were looking for stories of immediate impact from the vote. We got 430 responses from week 1 after the vote to week 3 or 4. And there were already stories of impact there. For example, in new collaborations, consortia being formed up, the UK partner being asked not to lead that team or even step out from the team. We had 40 cases of that. We had lots of people saying that they intended to leave the UK and work elsewhere. A handful had already taken up other offers. There was a handful of other people, 20 odd, that had turned down jobs in the UK because of Brexit. There were problems with the falling pound and purchases, and problems of job hiring freezes and investment freezes. So it had immediate impact. But what we wanted to do with those stories is get those out to media, get them through The Guardian, through The Independent, through the Financial Times, and so forth and so on, so that the wider public knew what was going on in science. They so that they understood how vital science was and how Brexit was actually hurting it. Because if we just communicate these direct to the politicians, they'll say, yeah, and they've got a ton on their plate at the moment. They are actually quite screwed because this is their bandwidth and this is what they need to handle Brexit and domestic issues. So you can't go directly to politicians with this. You have to drive up public awareness, and then you have leverage on the politicians. And it works because science is now at the centre of the UK's new industrial strategy. It is actually central to their economic future, the economic future of the country in terms of the policy. So where is the UK government now? Well, the reality is that we have triggered Article 50 and can revoke it at any time, but that is not what our government is saying. Our government is saying we have passed the point of no return and need to do Brexit all the way through. And Theresa May has called this snap election because she was just coming up to some extremely difficult negotiations with a thin majority in Parliament, and rather than go through all of that and be judged on it and have that fall apart, she decided, with the opposition being particularly weak, now was a good time to ramp up the patriotic rhetoric again and fill Parliament with lots of people who will support her as she forges whatever plan she can forge over the next 5 years. So it gives her more time and more control at a national level. What difference will it make as far as the EU looking at us is concerned? Probably not a lot. They know their terms. So that's where we are on the national level. And so when it comes to what we're doing now at Scientists for EU and what visions we need now, this is the key question. Because we have also had Donald Trump come into power in the States, and that hurts science in the States big time when you know their government won't champion science in the way that it has before. And you know the Republican Party has been dangerous for a long time on many, many anti-science issues. So we have an opportunity in Europe because the world is an interconnected network for science. We are all a global community, but the hub is increasingly here in Europe. 34% of the world's scientific output is produced from EU countries, 39% from all European countries, 25% from the US, 20% from China. These are the three superpowers. And if you were to think about who in the world is leading on science, not a lot of people realize worldwide that Europe really is stealing the crown of big science at the moment and innovative science at the moment. In terms of growth, the EU and Europe as a whole is growing faster than the US in terms of output and in terms of science base, and we should all capture this together. Now, what the UK can do for the EU is marketing, because the UK has such a reputation in science. It can say, as we go into these negotiations, everyone needs to know that the EU has done a fantastic job on science, and we want a new framework and a new structure where we all champion European science. And then you can bring in Switzerland, and you can bring in Norway, and you can think about a sort of reinvigorating what we've got. That's where I think we need to go. And the key question is, how are we going to be able to sell this, not just to the politicians and get together from the UK and EU and sell championing European science, not just to the politicians, but also the people. And this is my last point, because this is a key point. We saw this during the referendum debate, this people versus elites attitude. We know with technological changes coming thick and fast, more people across Europe, more people across the world are going to feel technologically left behind. So how do you build those bonds of loyalty whereby we are the champions of the people and the people feel as though we are their champions? And it can't be that we are handing them new medical devices, or we know better about their environment, we are the authoritarians and they are not. It has to be that they see their own jobs and their own children's jobs and their futures interwoven with science and technology. They need to know that the universities associated with their local communities are spinning out new businesses into those local communities. And when those new businesses grow, it brings in the painter decorator, the local hospitality, the security guards, the cleaners, the electricians, everything that is needed for growing businesses. And so these are the models of loyalty and bonds of loyalty that we need to get in at a community level and then communicate through the media so that these people are not left behind by science and technology, but rather see us as a solution for a better world for them in a very immediate way. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mike. We have started strong with Brexit and also with this very interesting message about the commitment of science with the community as a means to avoid a situation like, Brexit and Trump. Next time the next speaker is Rosario Mauritti from Portugal. She's a sociologist at the Center for Research and Studies in Sociology and at the University Institute of Lisbon. She's also a member of the executive board of the Higher Education Teacher Union, and she will talk about the structural challenges in science and society in Portugal. Thanks.
I will read because my English is not so good. First of all, I would like to thank Gilles and all of you who has been organizing this second meeting of Homo scientificus europaeus. It is well known that Portugal, as well as other southern and peripheral European countries, have been seriously affected by recession and economic budgetary problems since 2010. With a major impact in budgets allocated to science and higher education. In Portugal, this has occurred after a few decades of a serious attempt to reduce the knowledge gap in terms of an effective presence of the country in Europe of science. As I will try to show you with some indicators, this orientation, design and political fulfilled by the former Minister Mariano Gago has had significant results, namely in the institutionalization of scientific system, in incrementation of the number of researchers fully dedicated in science activities, and also in the number of publications registered in Web of Science. Although Portugal still far behind the status of the developed region in Central and Northern of Europe. As you may see, all these changes occurred along a significant increase in gross expenditure in research and development from 0.5% of GDP in 2000 to over 1.5% in 2010. In Europe, only Estonia, Luxembourg and Slovenia grew at a similar rate during that period. And Fortnite also confirmed that from 2011 to 2015, Portugal has increasingly diverged from the Europe of knowledge, where average expenditure on research and development remain around 2% of GDP. It is important to note that Germany is the only UE country that continues to increase its science system budget even in times of crisis. Some figures of Portuguese national system of science and technology in 2015. We spent 2,289,000 in research and development. We have about 50,000 people working in the sector, including researchers, technicians, and administrative staff, and 7.8% researchers per thousand active inhabitants. But work conditions of teachers and researchers. Permanent needs provided by fellowships, the large majority of science work. They have no social rights. They have no formal conditions to participate in their institution's structure of power. The majority of people who are integrated in higher education institutions have temporary contracts, 80% of teachers in private higher education, 55% in public polytechnics, 35% in public university. And we note a widespread violation of equity in fairness in part-time contracts. Lower salaries, sharp increase, double in the number of contact hours required, etc. This effort implemented, during the period of creation of the basis that sustained the development of Portuguese national scientific and technological system, main scientific policy instruments were the infrastructure building support competitive research projects and advancing training of human resources, namely financing individual fellowship programs, doctoral and postdoctoral. This effort implemented in the last 30 years resulted in total numbers of PhD holders per 1,000 inhabitants more than double. The international recognized scientific production of Portugal multiplied by 35 in terms of number of publications registered in Web of Science. The number of patents registered in Europe increased 45 times, and the technological balance of payments up since 2007. In this regard, I would like to emphasize the importance in this process of reconfiguration, not only of national system of science and technology, but of the Portuguese society as a whole, to the strong female protagonism. Women were the great engine of this development. So, in dynamic of modernization of the national system of science and technology, women have a growing presence within the scientific system at its various levels, although glass ceiling remains valid. Nowadays, 60% of the graduates in Portuguese population aged 25 to 64 years old are female. Portuguese female with 30 to 34 years old has reached 2020 goal of 40% with higher education, but the decline of male participation is still a major issue. To measure the effects of this process in all society, I've created an indicator that I named Graduate Qualification Index, who give us the relative weight of graduates enrolled in management professions, specialists, and technical staff. Is an analysis offering an idea of the importance of qualification in modernization of countries' production system as a whole, and can also measure the extent to which there is an effective conversion of qualifications into a qualifying professional insertion. In Portugal, graduate qualification index is 90% for men and 85% for women. It proves that the economic system has been observing flows of new skilled, although in the overwhelming majority of cases in a context of precariousness. Breakdown South-North, especially intense during the economic crisis, it's a major issue. Portugal is one of the European countries with the highest rate of high qualified individuals who immigrate. 63% of the high qualified Portuguese national registered as residents in other European countries immigrate between 2012 and 2014. Main reasons: the low employment rate in Portugal, low domestic salary levels, insufficient opportunity to adequately use their skills in the national working environment, and limited career prospect at home. Almost 20% of the highly qualified Portuguese immigrants estimate their time abroad will last 6 to 10 years, and 43% assume it will last over 10 years. if not compensate by inflow of equally qualified people, this brain drain could hinder Portugal competitiveness. Key challenges of the current political agenda. In a decade hit by recession and economic budgetary problems, which public policies for science, technology and education are necessary in the near future, both for individual member states as well the European Union as a whole. This question is relevant because it has become a commonplace to argue that science and technology permits everyday life. But a new debate is emerging about the related role of the state, with emphasis in Europe. The economic situation over last years has had major implication on emerging policy discussion through Europe on whether or not to cut future investment in the realm of science and higher education. Undoubtedly, there was progress in science, technology and higher education through Europe. But as a whole, Europe has met neither its goal nor its promises in its area. It is under this context that the challenges for Europe are immense, independent if they are global, national, or local in nature. I will focus on policies that have been implemented in Portugal since 2016 in the framework of an open democratic discussion involving civil societies, directors and presidents of higher education institutions, trade unions and associations of researchers, as well as all parties represented in Portuguese Parliament, but especially those who support the political arrangement of Geringonça, the contraption, the Portuguese left coalition. I emphasize two dimensions of active policies, one directed to people, the other to the system as a whole in their internal and international relations. Last week's Portuguese Parliament was finally voted all the amendments proposed to the new legal framework, which intends to stimulate scientific employment. Dignify science is the word we hear every time from our science ministry. It means changing postdoctoral fellowship in stable employment contracts, reducing the share of precariousness through the opening of tenders call, either for admission and career progression in science, are its main line of intervention. From a perspective of active policies directed at working conditions and people participate, it remains an uncertain challenge, prevents subordination to low-cost and bureaucratic management practices exclusive oriented to products with economic added value. It also remains a challenge, reduce administrative bureaucracy burden. The second level of the active politics wants to promote an evaluation of national system of science and technology based on transparent and stable criteria. And the point is defining funding based on scientific system in organizing collectives, collaborative use of resources within research and development institution, and not only in a defining group of researchers, promoting a stable framework favorable to qualification and institutional strengthening of the national system of science and technology, reversing the current trend of reducing science funding. To terminate, promoting new paradigms and conditions for responsible science and innovation policy in Portugal and across UE require the collective action of research and development institutions and a system approach to higher education, together with new initiatives toward international cooperation across an enlarged Europe. Growing scientific and technological capacity of Portugal and many other European peripheries is now associated with an increasing vulnerability as a result of growing international competition for qualified human resources. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Rosario. As you can see, this meeting, like the one that was done 3 years ago, is a unique opportunity really to have an outlook of the situation in different European countries here all together. It's really very valuable. And it's also interesting to see the similarities between different southern countries like Portugal and Spain, and the differences, like, for example, the difference in the political scenario, which in Portugal is really special compared to the rest of Europe. So now the stage is for Patrick Lemaire. He is a research director at the CNRS in Montpellier on marine invertebrates, if I'm not wrong. He is a part of the Science en Marche movement, an organization that started by promoting a march for science, but not this year, but in 2014, and then went on. So the stage is yours.
Thank you. Actually, there are two different things. So first of all, thanks for the invitation to talk in front of you. There are actually two different initiatives, and the names are related. We like to walk in France, it seems. So the first one, which I'm going to talk about mostly, is called Science en Marche, so science in March, and not March for science. It's even the journalists are getting confused in France about that. So basically, these are two different approaches to the same sort of issue, which I'm going to detail a little bit. Yes. Okay, so what's the state of science in France? So the numbers are a bit different from the ones that Mauricio was showing. So our public funding of public science and higher education is about 27 billion euros. Sounds a lot. It is actually a lot. It's very stable. And you will see that part of the issue, I mean, it's good. The politicians will say, we've actually sanctified the budget, which basically means we are stagnating the budget. There are about 200,000 scientists, lecturers, and all sorts of support staff. And so the budget is split into two main things. One is science per se. And France is a bit different from many countries because a lot of the, I would say, the hardcore science is done within the frameworks of specific research organizations and not within the universities. So we have the budget split in two, about 10 billion euros, which is for research per se, and about 14 billion euros, which is in higher education. These 14 billion euros correspond to 2.5 million university students, and this is a population which is sharply raising about 2 to 3% per year. Also, a specificity of France is that we have a dual system. We have on the one hand the universities, and on the other hand a sort of elite schools that we call the Grande École. So that's the public investment in science. And now what's happening on the private sector? So the private sector, we are not doing very well. So I think that the total figure is 2.23% of the gross domestic product in France, which is dedicated to science, research, and development. The private sector is where we are significantly under major countries like Germany, for example. So so the government has tried to increase this private R&D investment, especially by giving massive tax credits, which are very controversial in France. It's 6 billion euros per year. It doesn't seem to work very well. So that's the situation. Now, what are the major issues? The major issues is that about 70,000 people are non-permanent staff, meaning, on temporary contracts. So we surveyed very recently what was the average length of this contract. And what we find is that over 50% of people are on contracts that are less than 1 year. Now, that includes also about 40% of all the postdocs. Now, the only reason for doing a postdoc is basically to start preparing your next step in the career. And for that, you need some stability in order to develop your own project. So having postdoc contracts that are less than 1 year is fully counterproductive. The other thing is that the labs are underfunded. And so if you take the example of CNRS, more than 80% of the budget that comes from the state is actually dedicated to paying people. And only a bit less than 6% of these funds are used to actually support research, what is done within the labs. So something like 5.7% to pay research expenses in the labs is not optimal, to say the least. The other thing is the insufficient investment per student. So on the global OECD scale, we're actually not spending as much as other countries. But if you compare within France, we find that one student at university costs 11,000 euros to the state. One student for the first 2 years of this Grande École, this elite school curriculum, will cost 15,000. So there are great inequalities between the amount of funding in the different curricula in France. And this, you can actually trace it also to the social origin of the students. So the students who are most funded are actually the ones who come from the higher social strata of society. Next issue is that the increase in student population is absolutely not compensated in state budget. So people will say we sanctify the budget, but not the budget per student, the overall budget, which means that over the past 5 years, actually the amount of money invested per student in France has gone down 10%. And then the final issue, which is, I hope we'll have the opportunity to discuss that later today, is the poor employability of PhDs within France. I guess this is in part due to this dual nature of the higher education system. There are about 10% unemployment after 3 years after PhDs. It's getting better after 5 years, except in some fields. Biology is one field where unemployment after 5 years is actually still very high. Why is that? Well, in part because most of the non-academic sector will consider that a PhD is a lab rat and therefore should be employed in public research, but has no particular reason to be employed in the private sector or in government or higher administration. So you see, among the researchers in the private sector, 12% actually have a PhD and 54% have an engineering degree, and the engineering schools are among these elite schools. And then the final issue, which again is something which is rather recurrent in most countries, not in all of them, is the very poor scientific education of the political staff. And this is really at the center of all the issues that the country is facing. And I think what you were saying with Gago, or the situation that we can see in Germany, for example, I guess we'll discuss that later, shows that if you have politicians who are actually driven by science, the whole landscape is suddenly changing, and it can go very fast. So what did we do for that? So in 2014, we actually decided to start this thing, which is called Science en Marche. And it really came out of nowhere. So I had no major activist or militant background. When within a meeting, I just said, well, why don't we march on to Paris? And because France is a rather large country, we decided that instead of walking, we would actually cycle. I'll come back to that. So the three main missions of that was to increase the number of permanent positions in academia, and we're proposing to have 3,000 hirings per year over 10 years, to increase the fraction of core funding in public labs, and also the last point, which was very important to us, although not very easy always to get through to the academic community, was to increase the employability of PhDs outside of academia. The estimated cost of what we were proposing was about 2.2 billion euros per year, or an increase of 7% of the civilian HER budget. And we're also proposing ways to fund that, and which was basically to try and control better and to reform what I was mentioning, which was this very generous and highly inefficient R&D tax reduction scheme. So to try and push these missions, what we really wanted was to catch the attention of the public and of the journalists. But not only that, what we also realized, it was the academic community is a very difficult community to move. And so if you just tell them, well, go down the streets, without some sort of original idea, it won't work. So the idea in this case was, well, let's cycle. Let's cycle across France. And the advantage of that is that it would last for about 3 weeks. So for about 3 weeks, you would actually have coverage by the media of this thing. And it worked reasonably well. We had about 1,500 scientists cycling for 1 to 21 days. We also thought it was very important to couple public understanding of science to these initiatives. And so we had villages of science in major cities. And finally, about 8,000 people gathered in Paris to meet the cyclists as we came in. And that was a fairly moving time, just to come out and to see, wow, that was a crowd. You need to have support to do this. And so there was support by a large number of universities, learned societies, and I hope we'll have the occasion to discuss also the role of learned societies in these grassroots movements, and many labs. But we had absolutely no support, no official support from the research organization. And the reason was very simple. The heads of these organizations are nominated by the government. So basically, whenever they start saying something against the government, it's very easy to replace them. University presidents are elected, so they're much freer in their speech. So what did it lead to? Well, initially despair, because in spite of all that, nothing seemed to move in the first couple of months or 3 months. There was no response at all, basically, by the government. However, things started moving after a while, and eventually the junior minister for science and higher education resigned, and in part this was due to our action. Not the only reason, but in part that was due to what we did. Where what we did was important is in the nomination of a successor, who was someone who was much, much closer to the academic community than she was. She was very business-oriented. He was very much academia-oriented, Thierry Mandon. Now, the issue is that he actually fought for a decent budget and got the last year a sort of a decent budget, but he had very, very little power. And this is, again, something that we should discuss, is how to organize the ministers, etc., what type of power they should have if they are in charge. So in the end, things moved, and we got press coverage, and we used that to actually push a number of reports that we wrote. And we tried to write them in the most non-partisan, neutral language and as much hard facts as possible. And the approach of being absolutely non-partisan was really critical. And this is something that we'll find again in the March for Sciences in various countries. Basically, all parties are oblivious of science, so there is no need to be partisan to defend science. And I think I will just finish this slide and I will stop there. So the reports we published were mainly on the tax reduction scheme for public for private R&D. And we went to actually a senatorial hearing, and there we had an influence, and the influence was that for the first time in 20 years, the report by this senatorial commission was not signed by the members. They refused to sign because they were too split, in part because what we were saying was put forward, which displeased some of the people. We also did web polls towards the difficulties of lab heads, and this is very important to try and link back to the community and get feedback on what do you think should be changed. in ways that can be quantified. And also in precarity in higher education and research. These are some of the figures that I mentioned at the beginning. And finally, one report on the inequalities in higher education and research. After the cycling, it was very difficult to keep the impetus and to actually have people still mobilized in the labs. But what we managed to do was to keep some sort of a militant environment so that whenever there would be a spark, all the infrastructure will actually be here to support that this spark takes fire. And this is exactly what happened with the March for Science. So I'm not going to talk about the March for Science in France. I think there will be one video conference on that. But just that when the March for Science started, we found that basically everything was there. We had an infrastructure that we could actually give to the March for Science in terms of how to collect money, in terms of having all the contacts to the journalist immediately. And that was very important for the success of the March for Science in France. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot. Okay. Since we are short of time, I will leave the questions for the end and the debate, obviously, at the end of the morning. But there was one curious question by Mike about whether En Marche was inspired by Marche for Science or not.
Whether they were inspired by us, I slightly doubt. Whether we are inspired by them, absolutely not.
Okay. Okay,
we actually came 2 years ahead.
So now we switch to short contributions given in video conference from several other European countries. So I would start. I think we have both Varvara Trachana and Francesco Silos Labini connected from Greece and from Italy, respectively. So Varvara, I don't know if you can hear me. If you are there, I would give the word to you. Okay. Is it fine? Okay, 1 second. Okay, that's standard technical issues. Maybe we could take this time to, if there's any question in the public, otherwise I have mine, but any common question to the three speakers on the table? Okay, one question I had before this was exactly regarding the new French government, whether in the campaign there was any special remark about science, and you have pointed out that the scientific literacy of politicians is definitely an issue in France, and whether you expect that the situation will improve or not with the current government.
Well, the nice thing if you start from a zero background is that it cannot get worse. Mm-hmm. Whether it will improve with the new government, it's very difficult to know what this new government is actually going to do. We'll have a better idea towards the end of the week when the government will actually be nominated, and then we'll see what is the ranking of the science and higher education minister in the government, whether it's a very junior position, as it was in the past 5 years, or whether it's a much higher ranking position. The identity of the person will be very important as well, whether it's someone who has no political clout, or whether someone who has political clout. And the thing is, if you put a scientist at this position, in theory you think this is great, to have a scientist as a minister for science. But if the scientist is not a politician, then it means that they will have no power and they won't know how it works.
Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, so now I think we have Barbara connected. She's a cell biologist at the medical school of the University of Thessaloniki in Greece, and she has been actively participating in grassroots movements of researchers in Greece and also in Spain when she was a researcher here. So she will talk about the toxic effects of austerity-driven policies on science.
Thank you, Michele. Can you hear me, Michele? Can you hear me?
Yes, please go on.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Gilles, for inviting me for the second time in the Homo scientificus europaeus second meeting. I would like to begin by pointing out some facts about Greek's scientific research, some facts that some of you may find surprising. Science in Greece is of a higher standard than expected, considering the limited resources. Lack of funding is not a foreign feeling for a Greek researcher. It has been the harsh reality in our labs even before the crisis. For example, the funding for research in Greece from all sources in 2010 was standing to about 0.57% of the GDP, whereas the European median was around 2% in 2009. And then the bankruptcy came in 2010. It was a bankruptcy, despite the hypocritical refusal of our governments and the EU to call it that. It was a bankruptcy. It happened in 2010. And it was followed by 3 memoranda, 3 agreements by our governments and the Troika. For those that they haven't had the pleasure to be saved by these institutions, let me remind you that the Troika is the EU, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the IMF. So we signed these 3 memoranda in 2010 and 2 more following that. But it was the agreements between our governments and the Troika, the plans, let's say it, to get Greece out of the crisis, to save the country, in other words. And that means pages and pages, thousands of pages long manuscripts of these memoranda, I can summarize down to one word: austerity. Austerity for Greece means 28% unemployment rate, 60% unemployment rate between the young people, 25% decrease in the GDP, and 30% of the population living below poverty line, of the EU poverty line. And in between that, for our community, it means 50 to 70% decrease in the budgets for universities and research centers. And it means 40% salary cuts for university professors and researchers. And severe restriction in hiring. We are following what they said from the first memorandum even, the golden rule, 10-to-1, meaning 10 people retiring for 1 person to get hired in the public sector. And let me put a parenthesis here. This is how you met me. I was in 2013 member of the initiative of the non-appointed faculty members, university lecturers who were then elected and had to wait for more than 3 to 4 years to be placed in our universities because of this freezing in hiring. But let's say in this dark period that the country is facing, the scientific community in Greece, with a sense of responsibility, let's say, are best fulfilling its mission by achieving excellent performance in getting new grants. Example, in the 50 top research centers with the highest participation in the FP7 programs, there are 5 Greek centers. By maintaining high research productivity, 3rd position is the Greek productivity, meaning number of publication per million spent on RD. And this productivity is of high standards. Let me remind you that what was called then the miracle of the Greek science, when in 2012, the Greek contribution to the top 1% of most cited articles, the Greek contribution was 1.13%. That means just below the United States and above countries like France, Italy, or Canada. And this all document the robust presence of a community of highly educated, highly skilled, hardworking scientists with an outward orientation. But unfortunately, all the above is not enough to stop the brain draining. The draining of brains from this country has reached tremendous levels. They're talking about 300,000 people having left the country. 150,000 went to Germany, 50,000 to the UK. The migration, as you understand, is reaching levels analogous of the levels that the migration had back in the 60s or the 70s, but then was unskilled regular workers, what they call the gastarbeiters, the grandfathers and the fathers of these people that are living now. There's nothing like that. They are, most of them, they have a degree, a university degree, 1 or 2 master degrees, and many of them also have PhDs. Let me now read you an announcement of our government, an announcement that they made 2 to 3 weeks ago. The research, development, innovation triptych is the spearhead, the maximum national investment for the productive reconstruction of the country and its sustainable development perspective. Beautiful, no? We couldn't say it better. Our government said it 3 weeks ago. This announcement, with a little bit of an increase, a slight increase in the percentage of this GDP spent on RD, we have now reached 0.9% of course, falling GDP. But anyway, it's something. And also they announced 500 new posts in the universities, new positions opened in the universities after 7-8 years of freezing of hiring. Now we have these 500 new posts. And all of a sudden, we have some new calls for research grants from our government. We had 7 years with no calls for research grants whatsoever. And now we have 3 to 4 calls. And everybody, as you understand, everybody that I know is writing 3 to 4 proposals all in the same time, collaborating with whomever, trying to get some money in our labs. But let me remind you something, this is just calls. Calls are free. We haven't seen yet a euro in our labs. What we have seen, and what is a reality, is the announcement 2 days ago that we're going to have a new pay cut in the salaries of universities, professors, and researchers. On top of the 40%, as I told you before, of the pay cuts, now we're going to have another cut around 8%. And that means that a full professor in the university is having had such a hard time surviving in Greece that many are taking sabbaticals or leaves, whatever leaves they can get from the departments, and they go outside the country to work in other universities in order to support their families. And this new pay cut is part of the 4th memorandum. Now it's the 4th memorandum, the 4th plan to save the country that this new government is signing. Again, parenthesis, the new left-wing government who was voted in 2015 with the promise that will put an end to all that, the austerity after austerity and all that, which they didn't. And now they are also signing this memorandum with the Troika. And besides the salary cuts and the cuts in pensions, there is more increase in taxes coming. And this is just all with the promise of the IMF of reconstructing our debt. Just a promise. So because people have had enough, everybody, scientists and non-scientists, tomorrow there is a general strike in the country. Tomorrow, 17th of May, there is a general strike. And the researchers and universities professors are calling for the strike, are participating in the strike. And hopefully, people massively will demonstrate and protest against the government and the Troika. And if I can summarize this demonstration of their feelings, I will say it with one phrase: please, no more saving. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Varvara, for providing this very crude portrait of the kind of, let's say, torture that is being inflicted to Greece by the Troika. And so let's move to Francesco Silos Labini. He is a physicist at the Enrico Fermi Center in Rome, and he is also the editor of the blog Roars, Return on Academic Research, one of the most important online forum for discussion concerning researcher and higher education policies in Italy. He will talk about the effects of the financial crisis on Italian science and on the use and misuse of certain concepts like meritocracy, excellence, and research evaluation. Francesco, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Michele, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, good. So, thank you very much to all of you for inviting me again to this, I think, important meeting, where at least there is a sign of life from the field of research and universities in Europe. So, the situation in Italy is critical. In the last, 10 years, 10 years, we have faced a cut of 20% of the total budget in university research. And this corresponded to a cut of, for example, enrolled students of 20%, professors of 20%, administrative staff of 20%, courses of 20%, PhD courses of 40%, and budget for research project of 80%. So it's really like a post-war situation, even though we don't see, material ruins around us. In a sense, there are, in terms of human beings, real people that clearly have no possibility to continue in research and the university career. So, for example, the number, just to give you some numbers in more detail, the number of professors in physics in 10 years has been cut by 40%. So 40%, it's half, it's more, almost half of the all the professors in physics that we had 10 years ago. So then this another point which is very important is also not only the quantity of the cuts, but also the distribution in the territory. So while, for example, in the north, which is, as you all know, much richer than the center of the south, the cut was around 5%. In the south, it was much higher. So we basically the situation is that we have started from a situation in which there was already a big difference between North and South. In the last 10 years, this difference has increased. And now there are many universities in the south of Italy which are very close to have a financial crisis and then to close. So, okay, the number of students now in the age bracket between 25 and 34 years is the lowest in Europe and the lowest among the countries survived by the Oxen. So why this happened? Okay, this happened because there was a very, I think, a planned action to say, first of all, to downsize the whole university system, because say it is believed that university and higher education is not something that the country needs for for its economical system. And then, in the meantime, the remaining part of the university and research system, which was not touched by this reform, was put under political control in a way, and this was obtained by introducing a very funny way of evaluating research. Okay. Because, I mean, who can be against evaluation? If you say, okay, I don't like this kind of evaluating stuff, you say, okay, you're against evaluation, you don't want to be evaluated. But finally, instead, what happened was that the political power was in charge of establishing the rules of evaluation and also choosing the people that were in charge of evaluating the university and the research system. So this was important in all fields, even in astrophysics, which is my own field. But if you think about, for example, economics or political science or law, I mean, some subjects which are more sensible from the political point of view, clearly the freedom of research in those fields was highly touched, and it was highly influenced. So, for example, just to give you an example of the strange way the evaluation was implemented in Italy, there is a list of journals in some fields. No, there are journals which are good journals and bad journals. So, and who decide who are the good journal and the bad journal? This is the problem. Okay, there is no independence of the people who who are in charge of deciding these things. So the whole problem is again the fact that there is no interest from the political point of view, but first of all from the economical point of view in research and university and higher education. So why this happens? This happens because, say, the industrial system of Italy is very weak. And if one see what is the budget in research of development of the business part of it, Italy is with Spain, with the countries in Southern Europe, one of the lowest one. And this explains why, say, and even the big enterprises don't have the means to do research. So they thought, okay, let's take public research and let's drive it, let's push it to our own interest. That is something very different from curiosity-driven research. So the situation is getting worse and worse, and clearly the fact that there were these cuts was not something that had to be done in front of you of the economic crisis of 2007-2008. Italy was among a few countries in Europe which has adopted this reaction, so cut higher education and research, while in some other countries, like first of all Germany, who has increased by 20% its budget in these fields, they had a reaction which was quite the opposite. The idea was, okay, let's try to push on research and innovation and to see whether from those fields we could have a positive feedback in the economy of our countries. So this is, by the way, one of the reasons why our blog growers is so successful in Italy. We had 70 million visits in 5 years. This is because people is really disoriented. Even in newspapers, there is not a fair representation of the problems which we are facing. There are generation of people, the younger generation, which are excluded from scientific research and university, and a small elite of people, which is very close to the political power, which instead have taken all the say, direction of the university and research in the country. So this is a very alarming situation, and I think that in the short term there is no way out. But what we should do is to think about the middle or long term to see whether one can build a different way of doing it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Francesco. So, since our Polish colleague is not connected, I would ask whether there are questions from the public to the 5 people present or connected here. Otherwise, okay. Otherwise, I have a question, let's say, for the British representative, let's say, and the Greek one, so the two extremes, one may say, of the European crisis. So whether in both of your cases there is a hope of a way out. For example, in the case of Brexit, whether you still see an opportunity for rewinding, let's say, this process. And in the case of Greece, whether you see any opportunity of rewinding the austerity policies that are being applied.
Yes. So the situation in the UK is, as I said before, technically Article 50 is revocable. Practically, it would only likely be revoked if it was clear that the British population didn't want to go through with this, insert your own descriptive word here, thing that, that Brexit is going to be. But then there is also something that helps this from the EU side, and it's looking like Macron and Merkel together are discussing reforming EU treaties. Now, if they were to do that craftily, and they both are crafty people, so this may happen, in a way that not only ticks a lot of boxes for the EU 27 countries, but also starts unpicking some long-term tweaks to freedom of movement. For example, giving, like we have with Switzerland, giving locals rights for jobs before you then go and ask further afield. And they were to sort that out within just the EU themselves, then there would be a new case that could be made at home in the UK for, you know what, we've all learned a lot from this process, and us doing Brexit helped kick them to, you know, reform a few key things. Shall we actually consider staying, because maybe what we've got is better than other options that we're looking at? That would be the way it might pan out. And in that case, having an election now in 5 more years of one government also does help that as well. So I do see a way in which it could be resolved that we would stay in a reformed EU rather than the EU that we just rejected, because of course it's a unelected dictatorship imposing stuff on us.
Okay. And Varvara, what about you? Do you see any sign of hope?
There is hope, of course there is hope. Our Prime Minister, in one meeting after the other with the EU authorities, has been saying that they all recognize that the austerity is not the way to go. And Greece is the country to solve that in its best. It's not working, people, so stop doing it. So, yeah, there is hope. If the Brexit now will help people understand that we're going towards the wrong direction, and the Greece situation make them see that in a clearer eye, maybe there is hope. But definitely, the way things are going right now, it's not going to work. And I'm afraid after the Brexit, we might have a Brexit. They beat the street, by the way. We're supposed to get out fast.
Okay, thanks.
Can I make a little comment on Greece and what I know of Greece? I've got friends who are researchers in Greece, and they say that the EU science program was absolutely vital when their own government was drawing out funds. And also I'm aware that Yanis Varoufakis said that during the crisis, Macron was one person who actually really desperately wanted to help Greece, but was shut down a lot by Schäuble. So there may be opportunities for the EU, when it has more money and more confidence, to actually go back and help out Greece in a way that it didn't before. And I think also with the science program, when we're looking at FP9 now, what I'm advocating, and what I hope others will advocate too, is that instead of just dumping in structural funds, you actually turn those structural funds into a copy of Horizon 2020 for pairing up the Western European countries with the peripheral countries in order to do that transfer of skills and that networking, and do it in a grant-like way where you can actually study progress and so forth. At the moment, money's sort of being shoveled in, but if you were to have a semi-competitive scheme that mirrors what we do in Horizon 2020, so borrows that widening participation stream and really builds that up, then you could really start networking in a whole load of talent and investment into those countries that need it within the EU.
Yeah, in fact, this may be a point to put, let's say, on the agenda of the possible future HSE cloud, maybe. So I think there are two remarks, please.
Ultimately, brain circulation is what you want rather than brain drain, because when you leave areas starved out, then they have not the proper training to produce people later on, and you don't get the diversity that you want. The EU is meant to be a team where those who do well invest in those regions that are doing more poorly, so that you've got a bigger society where everyone growing up, wherever you grow up, can have access to that high quality of life and have access to opportunities. So I myself have written a lot about this because I was in Slovenia and suffered from the Commission paying me at local rate, which wasn't enough for me to live off. So I had to do English revisions in order to make extra money, and then I still couldn't, knowing that if I were doing the exact same project I was on in London, I would get triple salary. So I came back to London and got triple the salary that I was on. And this is a real issue that I have, and this is why I have thought a lot and talked a lot and written a lot about how you can change Horizon 2020 and the structural funds and the structure of it overall to ensure that you're getting the know-how from the West invested in the East, because there are benefits for all in that. When we build up the strength of all the peripheral countries, the whole team is stronger overall, and when we have our Western institutions engaged in those activities of training up competence in other countries, that is then also a marketable skill that they can take around the world, whether it be Africa, Asia, or South America. So I see lots of synergies that should happen, and I think that there's a huge amount of potential in Southern and Eastern Europe which is going underinvested in. And I think if we can get the proper investment in there in the right way and structure, then that's what the EU should be about, and European science can go from strength to strength because there is huge potential there. I know, I've met it, I've worked with it. Some of the brightest people I've met were in Slovenia when I was working there.
Any remark from France, and then we go to the coffee break?
It's interesting.
Ah, okay, one more question. Okay, but
Okay.
please make your remark, Patrick.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting because if you read the French press, you will hear all the time, oh, beware, we're victims of brain drain. But as a matter of fact, what Martin is saying is right. We actually hire 25% of permanent CNRS researchers who are non-French. So we can also attract, and actually in science, being able to attract foreigners to your own system is a measure of success. So this is interesting. I guess the best, we should recognize that science is a competitive occupation, much more competitive than most things that people consider competitive. If you make the second best car, you're rich. If you're the second to discover something, you haven't discovered anything. And that makes a very, and so this should be taken into consideration in the way the public sees science. This is a competitive activity. How can we make sure that Europe works? I think Mike was completely right. Infrastructure. We need to build infrastructure in all the countries, and not just in the wealthiest countries.
Okay, one more comment, question, remark, and then we stop.
One question. My name is Luc van Dijk, and I'm afraid I only represent myself here. I have a question for French and Portuguese friends. It's about precarity. I think I know very well what precarity is. I'm working since almost 30 years now, and I've never had a contract longer than 3 years. But what you presented, my question is, don't you think that by trying to solve the problem of this generation, you create a problem for the next generation, because you cannot actually create positions for each generation? I mean, the number of PhD and postdocs will go on increasing probably. If you give permanent contracts now to a large chunk of these people, what are you going to do with the next generation? And related to this, the UK research system is a magnet for many researchers from all over the world. So how do you explain this while the UK is the country of precarity par excellence?
Well, in the Portuguese system now, the middle age of teachers and special teachers are in public system 50 years old. In private system, around 2 years worse. So these people are finish their time, and the system has been called for about 15 years. No entries, no new entries for. So, in fact, if we create conditions for researchers and teachers to do their work without with the perspective of future, we are consolidate the system, and we are creating new alternatives for the next generation. That's my perspective.
At the same time, it's like a pyramid.
Positions are in the base of the system. So they close the system to new entries, and they also close the progression. It's impossible to recreate science and to innovate with these conditions. No one wants to do better because they have no recognition on their work. I think there are limits in our passions to do a better work if we don't feel that we are paid or we are recognized for our time and for our work.
Yeah. If you don't mind, since we are running a bit late, I would suggest to make our coffee break a very short one and continue the discussion during the coffee break, and then we will have option to have a broader discussion at the debate at the end. So,
can I just say one word with respect to the question, because France was also involved.
One word.
And I think what's happening here, we have to see that the student population is growing, and this is going to go on for a while. So, first of all, the people we are hiring now, we will actually need them for quite a while. Now, each professor who's hired is teaching 192 hours per week. Well, per year, sorry. Yeah, not per week, yes. Thank you. Are you a teacher? And this is a very high load. So even if the student population will ultimately stay put, just decreasing this amount of hours per year would actually increase the attractivity of lecturer positions.
Okay.
Now, the second point is we are actually advocating that the major issue is jobs for PhDs and people with a science education in the private sector and in administration beyond higher education and research, because that's where the majority of people will ultimately be.
Okay, so we meet again at 12:05, so we have 5 minutes for the coffee break, so 12:05, and we will have representatives of the science marches of 4 different countries. See you later.